using Word, you can just click on a dictate icon and you can dictate into Word. That could be pretty convenient if you're writing a draft or something and want to take notes on the meeting or something like that.
Wow, this hit differently.
That is when I knew that this was the Lord.
That's a good question.
I figure if I do it, it'll force me to learn it.
Well, that's why I know him.
The Scene with Sean Wlliam, Behind the Book, featuring today's book.
Hello, folks, and thank you once again for stepping into the scene with me, Sean Wlliam. And today on the show, personally for me, is very, very fun. I'm very interested in this topic. Now, the book we're talking about today is Computing Power Drives the Future. And it's written, and it's no other person, I believe, would be able to write a book, and no one is more qualified, I believe, too. Spending his entire career in the artificial intelligence scene way before AI was a household term. Let's all please welcome, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. William Meisel. Welcome to the show, Bill.
Thank you.
So, Bill, this book of yours, obviously now AI everywhere, household terminology, no longer just one of those terms from back in the day wherein people would think about singularities, robots taking over, all that nonsense. But before we actually get into the book, Bill, I want to ask you, because this is a very technical topic, very, 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 especially with the way you wrote it, right? So much information, plethora. But before we get into that, what inspired you to put pen to paper and actually come up with Computing Power Drives the Future?
Well, my background, as you said, is that I was involved with this for a long time. One of the things I did is to create a company backed by venture capitalists that I ran for 10 years. The company actually, after the venture capitalists threw me out for losing money for 10 years, it went on for years using some of the technology. We were successful technically, but it turned out that it took a lot more computing power to do the speech recognition than we expected. And so the cost for doing it made it impractical as a commercial thing. As you know now, of course, speech recognition, you talk to your phone. It's kind of interesting because it seems like very often people talk about artificial intelligence as if it's all it is these large language models, right, like ChatGPT, but of course now everybody talks, I shouldn't say everybody, but almost everybody talks to their smartphone, Siri, Google Assistant on a Windows phone, and the or you might have an Alexa, an Amazon at home that you talk to, which is pretty impressive. I don't know if you use it very often.
Yeah, I do.
It's amazing.
Actually, yeah.
Stop and think about that just for a second, because we're talking here about how computing power has gotten to the point where you can talk to a computer. Think what that means. You say something, the audio goes over the internet, it's processed using some neural networks. Neural networks, which are the basis of today's AI, are what has made speech recognition work so well. It's a big speech recognition now, and but it then processes this using neural networks and responds within a fraction of a second,
right, with
audio generates from text. I mean, that there's no real person speaking that. That's a computer speaking, and it sounds very much like a real human, right?
Yeah.
So that business of computers, if you stop and think about it, that's a huge change from the past. And sometimes people don't even think of that as artificial intelligence anymore, But fundamentally, we originally artificial intelligence was when the computer did something that used to be only humans did, and that's certainly what speech recognition. Nowadays, people often that when people talk about artificial intelligence, they don't recognize all the things that have been done with artificial intelligence and the neural networks that it does. Now, neural networks using machine learning, sometimes called deep learning, are the fundamental that is working in neural networks today. The large language models are very, very large neural networks, and the ones they're spending billions of dollars to build for the next generation are using even more computing power.
Right.
But when a lot of the articles today talk as if the only thing that's artificial intelligence is large language models. So
yeah.
to make two really key points here. One key is that the neural networks and artificial intelligence have been made possible by the increasing computing power. Moore's law, famous for saying that the number of transistors you could fit on a chip would double every 2 years, which another way of saying that is that computing power would drop in price by a factor of 2 every 2 years. So that's a huge exponential increase. And that computing power that makes those neural networks practical has grown even faster than the Moore's law, that 2 times law, because you stop at, the Moore's law was based upon just how many transistors you could fit on a chip. NVIDIA cards, instead of just trying to fit more more transistors on a chip, it does a lot of things in parallel. That is, instead of one thing at a time, it does multiple things at a time. And most people are pretty well aware that NVIDIA has been so successful that's either the first or second largest stock by value on the stock exchange. So that's one way. Computing power is growing even faster. As it's today, the amount of computing power that has made neural networks practical, the actual technology was described fully in the 1980s, but nobody could because it was too expensive to run. So the reason my book's called Computing Power instead of something like neural networks or artificial intelligence is that computing power got to the point where you could use the neural network technology. So computing power is driving a heck of a lot of things right now. And that is, so you can ask the question, if computing power passed a threshold, these large language models and artificial intelligence more useful generally, then what's it going to do next? I mean, it's going to pass. It's cheaper, and for one thing, you see have all these companies literally spending billions of dollars now. Maybe I can give some examples of that.
Of course. Go ahead.
So, the large language models like ChatGPT or Anthropic's Claude use the largest neural networks to date and train them to guess an article using both the context of the article, the structure of the sentence, and the location of the paragraph within the article, such as the introduction, body, and conclusion. So, in other words, people try to simplify saying by it guesses the next word. That's a simplification. It has to determine it has to create a structure, the introduction, the body, and conclusion. When you read an article that is created, it writes it like a human might. They've
Right.
trained it with a huge amount of computing and a huge amount of data to get accurate at this, just so they could generate an article based on a few keywords in a request. Even the developers, how well the software could imitate a human writer.
Right.
So the current large language models are best used as an aid to a human by summarizing knowledge in an area that a human can check, remove, or expand. Because the models are summarizing the data they have analyzed that is related to the keywords in the request, they can sometimes deliver results that reflect misinformation or objectionable content in the data they have analyzed. They also can create information similar to data they have analyzed, but which is not factual, such as referencing patents that don't exist. Such mistakes are often hallucinations. I'm sure you've heard that term.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
This has led to companies using the technology in operations less than you might expect. The U.S. Census Bureau recently reported that only around 10% of firms meaningfully use the technology. This is the large language model.
Right.
A recent study by firm McKinsey concluded that for most organizations, the use of AI has not yet significantly affected enterprise-wide profits. The Economist magazine recently summarized in an article, quote, 3 years ago into the generative AI wave, demand for the technology looks surprisingly flimsy. MIT Technology titled a recent article on the subject, quote, the Great AI Hype Correction of 2025. There's further wide discussion that providers of generative AI models will have difficulty making profits to cover their high expenses. This is not to say that the generative models won't be an important aid to human tasks, but the technology has limitations.
That's actually really shocking to me, Mr. Meisel, or Bill, because if you think about it, nowadays we're talking. Obviously, there's all this scare factor, right, or fright factor about AI taking over human jobs and everything, and I'd like to think that AI has replaced a lot of the mundane tasks, so to speak, right? Whether it's like you mentioned earlier, a regular AI voice assistant, or probably doing the repetitive tasks of someone just answering emails, right? That's actually really shocking to me. But one thing I want to talk about is you mentioned earlier about the how people nowadays, especially with the kids that are growing up who have never actually experienced a life without, the AI of every day, right? But yeah, it started out with, like you mentioned, very, very simple models. And now we are at the point wherein there are shortages for RAM in PCs, GPUs, as you mentioned, NVIDIA being the second most expensive stock these days. Yeah, rightfully so. And because of that, their graphics cards are getting really, really expensive. So where, in your opinion, your professional opinion and your expertise and everything, where do you see this going in terms of the limit? Because obviously, currently as we speak, as I mentioned, there's already a shortage of RAM, already going to be a shortage of SSDs. We're just talking about the everyday PC for the everyday person. Where do you see this reaching to a point wherein it's actually going to be a limit for us to achieve more in terms of what AI can do?
Well, I've got on the record in my book, Computing Power Drives the Future, and blog entries based on the same ideas, predicting the next generation of generative AI using much larger neural networks will fail completely because of the lack of sufficient quality data needed to make the larger networks avoid creating nonsense.
Yeah.
Nonsense will result from the huge number of parameters being optimized in the very large models, overfitting the data, which gives too much individual data entries. Alex Hearn, the AI writer for The Economist magazine, noted in a recent interview that there's a scaling law the one has to put in 10 times as much in to get twice as much out. That means you have to have the next generation of that they're spending these billions of dollars on, and even creating power plants and
Right.
water sources to cool the computers.
Right.
They're a huge data problem for the very large neural networks being built. I said the larger models will generate artificial ignorance rather than artificial intelligence.
Hey, that's good. That's good.
I'm afraid that that's going to surprise a bunch of people that build these huge computing centers. Yet they support ever larger computer centers continue. For example, Meta chief executive Mark Zuckerberg recently posted, quote, Meta is planning to build tens of gigawatts this decade and hundreds of gigawatts or more over time. The idea of gigawatts is intuitive, but basically what he's saying is more and more. All of the major technology companies tend to be investing in the huge data centers to develop the next generation of AI. There's evidence that this attempt to expand neural networks is already failing. For example, the next generation GPT, called ChatGPT-5, advertises an update to ChatGPT-4, did not exhibit improved behavior to the extent that OpenAI CEO Altman recently set off a, quote, code red, unquote, alert to employees to improve ChatGPT and delay other product developments, according to the Wall Street Journal. A number of other companies delayed announcing new versions, apparently because of problems with their behavior. Jan LeCun, scientist at Meta's AI lab and a professor at New York University, recently said, quote, this idea that we're going to just scale up the current large language models and eventually human-level AI will emerge, I don't believe this at all, not for 1 second.
Really? Okay.
Yeah, I feel the same way. I think the idea that you're just going to throw more and more data, it's smarter, the quality of the data. And if you need 10 times more data, they already had trouble when they tried to build these large language models.
Right.
The initial language models said some pretty terrible things, and they're still doing it. But what they've done is tens of thousands of people looking at least thousands of people looking at these things, and when they find they do something wrong, they try to correct it. They then retrain it to say, don't do this, and so that you get fewer and fewer of the bad things. Learn what's bad, but that's a very slow and difficult problem. And when you just go to these huge, larger ones, the impending failure of these large investments in the very large neural networks has huge implications for the profitability of the companies investing billions in the huge computing centers. And of course, all these huge investments in computer centers usually involve investments in the electrical power plants to support them and a water supply to cool them, making it even harder to make the large models a profitable business. This huge investment will profits, at least temporarily. Even if the larger models do improve results somewhat, there will be many companies competing to be your choice of generative AI, further reducing their ability to make a profit. And the investments in very large neural networks will not create super intelligence.
That being said, though, Bill, you mentioned about competition, right? Personally, just a quick side note: what's your favorite generative AI these days?
I like Anthropic's Claude, partly because it sometimes references its sources, so you can double check it. So it makes it easier to use it the way I would use it. Have it give me a draft of a subject I'm interested in, and then I can look deeper into the subjects that they suggest should be covered. And they're pretty good at finding, at least, it's a little bit like a web search, where the results of the web instead of a list of websites. That's a pretty powerful thing.
Claude has a lot of good reviews these days too. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Also, if you look at Anthropic, what they did, by the way, for what it's worth, what what they actually did it with spending less money by using what they called a mixture of experts approach. In other
Yeah.
words, they basically data on they sort of clustered the data that was similar on such
Hmm.
similar subjects, say or vaccines
Right.
as a subtopic,
Yeah.
so forth. Structured these and created with limited data um, the result that uh, that with that limited data that was more accurate in that subcategory, that specific expert, and then they built a sort of a managing
Hmm.
uh, network to decide which experts could help answer a given question.
Hmm.
If you ask a question on vaccines, you're not really interested in a recipe for chicken soup.
Yeah. Yeah.
Stop and think about it. That's what they try to do with these huge, large language models is know everything. So
Right.
by down, you can do that by just the way you structure the neural network that you're building. I mean, I've argued in my book that if you actually try to just cluster data um, in by similarity first, you could use the similarity of articles like web pages or articles from journals and so forth. Use their similarity to decide which ones are on similar topics, and use those
Hmm.
to build a neural network with a much smaller size.
Yeah.
Um, the uh, One of the things that so now let's stop and think about this a minute. It was
Sure.
interesting because so here we're going to have these companies building these very hard, very large neural networks, and when they're all done, what do they have? They have computer centers that are hugely powerful. They have a lot more computer power than was previously available. Now, what are they going to do with those when they find out they don't deliver super intelligence? That they're just delivering a lot of hallucinations or creating a lot of other problems.
Yeah.
What are they going to do? Well, uh, those huge computer centers create are basically computer centers that deliver computer power. We have all these huge computer centers with everybody competing, trying to sell that computer power. Because if you stop and think about it, um, Amazon Web Services, if you look at Amazon Web Services, which rents out computing power on big computers,
Yeah.
um, they actually make something like 50% of their profit from Amazon Web
Wow.
Services, not by selling. It's only 15% of their revenue, but it's almost 50% of their profit. But
Mm.
and so that's what they're going to try to use these for. They're going to try to compete with Amazon Web Services. Everybody's going to all these big computing power companies that from Microsoft, the list of the big technology
Yeah.
companies.
Yeah. Hmm. Hmm.
They're all going to be competing, and of course, there's something plenty in China too. China, in
Yeah.
fact, is making a big trying. They're trying to build the next generation of AI. They're going and in fact, it was a Chinese company, DeepSeek,
Oh
that
yeah.
came up with the mixture of experts approach that I've praised.
Yep. Yep.
So um, they're all going to be competing, and this is going to drive down the prices for advanced computing resources, just like an increased supply of oil creates a drop in oil prices. The
Hmm.
computer power is fundamental to our economy as fuel, and that's going to be allow a lot of major innovations.
Right. Well, I think, a lot of our viewers and listeners over here want to really hear this from an expert in the field. And just to pivot a little bit, because, for the common everyday person who's not really well versed in this area, they're thinking of AI with the perspective of fear, or coming from the perspective of fear. Number one, there's the possibility, but we can entertain the idea, right? There's the possibility of it taking jobs. There's the possibility of it taking over the world, the singularity, as I mentioned earlier. What in your opinion, how likely is that ever gonna happen? You know, the singularity, AI talking to other AI to take over the world, all these other things. Tell us, Bill.
Well, you know that the just to take the basic argument that essentially innovation will take over jobs. That's been an argument that's gone on and on for forever and ever. You
Right.
know, obviously looms created a problem for women that were weaving things. Excuse me,
Yeah.
but it also picked a it also created a huge number of new jobs. You know, I mentioned, for example,
Right.
all the people that are now just to check out the bad things that the large language models are doing. That's a new job. Or if you stop and think about it, when every job now, uh, all this technology creates more tasks for a given job. For example, I suspect you spend a certain amount of time every day reading and writing email, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, you couldn't before email was available. Oh, sorry about that.
It's okay. Don't worry about it.
So the all that cheap computing power will allow an awful lot of innovations, but certainly the one of the things I think that so you might ask, so for example, um, well, I guess the short answer is I don't think AI is going to take over all jobs.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think it's going to be. I've already said that. So I don't think it's going to take over all jobs, and I've quoted some statistics that show that it's not
Right.
intending to do. In fact, companies are all now saying we have people task forces trying to decide how they should use AI. It's going to be a breakthrough,
Right.
and that's really not very reasonable.
Okay.
So
Well,
the
yeah.
go ahead.
I just wanted to pivot now and talk a little bit about the book. Now, obviously, you wrote this book for a purpose, and you are very passionate and very knowledgeable in the field. But I guess I want to ask you this question, Bill. What is your end goal for computing power drives in the future? Because it's not enough for a person who is an expert in the field to put pen to paper, right? That's a whole separate thing. But what do you hope to achieve by putting this book out there and getting it into the hands of readers?
Well, one of the things I tried to argue is that the thing that's fundamental is not particularly artificial intelligence.
Hmm.
The fact that we call it intelligence obviously draws our attention to it and makes us fear it because you're calling it intelligence instead of just computing power. But
Mm.
computing power has done things uh, to to uh, to make a success. Um, but if the uh, I think the major innovation that one of the things I wanted to emphasize is what I think is the next breakthrough that's going to be created by this
Yeah.
cheap computer. And what I think that's going to be is what we call digital assistants. You know, the
Right.
most obvious ones like Apple Siri and Google
Uh-huh.
Assistant and Amazon Alexa. But what a lot of people don't realize is that when you go to the chat bots where you type to them, like Chat GPT
Hmm.
and Google Gemini, you're typing to them.
I'm not
They
quite
also
sure how to help you with that.
Yeah.
Alexa. So
I'm
we
not quite sure how to help you with that.
stop talking, Alexa.
Okay, go ahead.
So uh, you know. What we're going to move is to use human language. What we don't realize is that you can talk or type to almost any of these things. For example, you can talk to ChatGPT or Google Gemini,
Hmm.
and you can to Apple Siri and Google Assistant, which most people don't realize. So, in other words, now your digital assistant, the same digital assistant you can talk or type to for all these various types of digital assistants.
Right.
Um, that means that you can use them in private, so you can continue a dialogue uh, when talking out loud would be impolite, or when you would be the information would be private. Account balance. You know, if you ask for an account balance in public, you don't want it to be public, so you type to your digital assistant, "What's my account balance?" For example.
Right.
And also, the trend that's going on now, right now, is that what we have, despite the fact they seem pretty impressive.
Mm-hmm.
You know, itself for talking to computers has gone pretty far,
Right.
but you know, if you use Apple Siri, very often they'll say, "Here's what I found," and drop you into a web search.
Mm-hmm.
So they're increasingly attempting to continue a dialogue by giving you answers rather than just dropping you into a list of websites.
Yep.
The talker type makes it possible to continue doing that in public. And the increased computing power will allow the digital assistants to be more like communicating with another human, and that they will be able to continue a conversation,
Mm-hmm.
remembering the context of the current as well as previous interactions.
Right.
They will learn more about you in particular as you use them. New devices under development, such as a reported wearable pen from Apple and smart glasses from Meta, would seem to require speech recognition as the primary interface.
Right.
You know, if you have a wearable pen, you can't exactly type to it.
Mm-hmm.
The current assistants are already becoming an alternative to web search. We know how profitable web search can be by looking at Google's profits.
Right.
Existing assistants, including Siri and Google Assistant, can also connect to other companies while continuing a conversation, although many users are unaware of that functionality and which companies support it. Google Assistant, for example, can connect you with Starbucks to order order coffee via voice, and the U.S. Bank's customer service voice bots. You could, for example, ask for your bank balance while talking to the digital assistant, and then continue a conversation on another subject. Companies are beginning to realize that many people are getting impressions of what their company does from AI chatbots. A New York Times article quoted Brian Stempeck, a co-founder of Evertune, an AI startup that helps companies analyze what chatbots are saying about them, saying, quote, "There's a new influencer you need to reach, and it's this AI model.
Mm-hmm.
This will be a growing." You could also control devices like Ring doorbells with Google Assistant. Apple Siri can, for example, call someone in your contacts by voice. You can just say, "Call Joe for me, please."
Bill, that's one of the things, or one of the reasons why people, and sorry to interrupt, okay? It's just, while it's still there, that's one of the biggest reasons why people are so reliant these days on AI, right? Or on these generative AIs that, people can just have on their phones. Like you mentioned, Siri, Google Assistant, whatever. But I think one of the scary things is that people, because of this increasing reliance on AI, people or the companies are starting to monetize their products like crazy. So you mentioned earlier how these platforms or these generative AIs can remember and continuously keep going with their conversations, right? But there are some, and I'm not sure if you're aware of some of these platforms, that they only have a limited amount of basically entries that you can go back and forth with them on before you'd have to basically upgrade your subscription to a pro version so that you can continuously use their stuff. Is that a consequence of what you mentioned earlier in terms of 10 times putting in and 2 times putting out? Do you think that's a consequence?
I think that you actually will probably see fewer ads because nobody likes these ads.
Of course.
And you have to avoid them. Nobody likes to pay. So if you stop and think about it, when you do a search with Google Assistant, you don't typically pay. I don't think, I'm not even sure Google has a pay level, but
Yeah, no, they
because the
don't.
base, it's so what they make money from ads,
Mm-hmm.
and so conversational AI, if what you do is you ask your digital assistant to contact you to a company, that company has to now support a conversational interaction. That's going to be as important as today it is to have a website. So
Mm.
everyone's going to have a digital assistant for their service. Um, Apple recently reported a change in executives and an increased focus on improving its digital assistant Siri. More generally, almost all the leading technology company are also investing in the next generation of generative AI. I've argued they'll end up with huge computers instead of seek to find uses for all that computer power they've invested in. And these talk and type digital systems become a major way consumers access the internet. Now stop and think of that. What that means. That
Yeah.
means companies are going to have to pay for being connected to these digital assistants, which is essentially a new form of search. Uh, and so they will pay for connections, and you won't have to listen to ads because
Mm-hmm.
that's the way that Google makes money. That's the way that these companies are going to make money.
Right.
Um, the technology companies will compete to profit from this opportunity by charging for companies to connect to software programs. If some
Mm-hmm.
smaller talented aspects of building these assistants, they are likely to be acquired by the larger companies for their talent and for their intellectual property. An interesting side effect of the control of the internet accessed by these large technology companies with reputations to support is that they will
Right.
be under to avoid the assistants directly providing objectionable content such as pornography or hate speech,
Mm.
avoiding simple misinformation as much as possible. The companies already hire many human monitors, as I've mentioned. The assistant models can learn to avoid such content automatically through feedback from human review. Hopefully, this process will result in less misinformation and objectionable content being widely distributed through the internet and social networks as more people depend on their assistants for internet access.
Yeah.
By the way, I want to emphasize that the
Sure.
effectiveness of conversation rather than a web listing, because I'm making this a big argument that we're
Yeah.
going to want to not have to go through a whole bunch of websites to get an answer.
Yeah.
In an example of the effectiveness of a conversation rather than a web listing in engaging a user, two scientific studies published recently in the scientific journals Nature and Science found that a short interaction with the chatbot powered by AI could meaningfully shift some people's opinions about a political candidate or issue. One of the one of the
Mm-hmm.
studies found that having a brief conversation with a trained chatbot proved about 4 times as persuasive as television ads from recent American presidential
Oh
elections.
wow. Really?
Yeah, if you stop and think about it, people, if you're having a conversation with somebody and they say, "Well, I disagree with you,"
Mm.
you try to persuade them. You find out what things tend to be
Right.
a little bit persuasive, getting their reaction to them.
Mm.
That interaction can be much more effective than just
So
showing.
true.
I
That's
mean,
so true.
today, but sometimes with today's ads, they're all trying to be so creative that sometimes I don't even know what they're advertising. I don't know if you got that.
You're completely right. You're completely right, Bill. And I, you
That
know,
was true about Super Bowl ads, for example.
super true. There are a lot of weird ones, especially these days. But Bill, going back to it, and I think I want to, before we end the show, I have to ask you this question. It's a bit of a tradition here in the show. in the context or taking your book into consideration, okay, with the context of your book, if you were only allowed to give one piece of advice to the world and the viewers and the listeners right now, what would it be?
I think my advice would be to um, try to use the interactive nature of that's available to you. For example, um, a lot of people don't really even notice that when they're using Word, you can just click on a dictate icon and you can dictate into Word. That can be pretty convenient if you're writing a draft of something and want to take notes on a meeting or something like that. Uh, so just keep your maybe start trying to learn what you can do with Apple Siri and Google Assistant because they're investing in those and they should be getting better over time. Now this won't, when you predict the future, you have to be very careful. It usually takes a lot longer for these things for innovations to come. But I would say that what you should consider as a major driver of the future, as my book's title suggests,
Mhm.
is what you're going to do with computers. So spend some time trying to learn some of the capabilities that companies are already delivering to you, often for free,
Mhm.
and learn learn to discover. I think it's probably frustrating uh, to when you every time you use a new application, you end up having to find out some strange new
Yep, that's for sure.
things. I
Yeah.
think over time you'll just be able to ask your computer, "How do I do that?" So creating your own, uh, trying to create your own ability to deal with the digital assistants with the computing technology that's available there. I, China is, for example, is putting a huge investment
Hmm.
into tech companies, and they don't have the regulations and the danger that you have with China in particular, of course, is if you used a digital assistant in Chinese that was controlled by the Chinese government, you might feel that that it's going to what its content's going to be controlled too. So I
Hmm.
don't know about how to. I think there's other sources.
Yeah,
They,
yeah,
China will have to release some of its control over content eventually
right.
if they're going to be competitive.
Wow. Now, Bill, please tell the folks at home where they can grab a copy of the book.
Well, the easiest place, of course, is Amazon, but I suspect I don't know what the sources are. It's generally it's generally available, though, both in terms of Kindle versions and paperback.
Awesome. Okay, folks, and the links are going to be in the description below. So if please, coming from an expert, coming from the most informative episode we've ever had here on the scene, take Bill's advice. Please study. Because I myself, just going to be very frank with you, Bill, I had no idea Microsoft Word could do that dictate thing. So thank you. So yeah, that's really good advice coming from an expert in the field. And Bill, thank you so much for stepping into the scene with us today. We appreciate you. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, and folks, thank you so much, and we'll see you in the next scene. Bye bye.